In the status quo, America neglects its role in creating violence. Instead, they blame a subset of the population, vote affirmative to end this. From 13 writes, Americans don't blame guns, but a subset of the population. They claim, quote, it's mostly a matter of thugs killing thugs, but many of these people carry guns to protect themselves. However, if two people carry a confrontation ends with one dead and the other in prison for life. Young men killing children do not manufacture their own guns or organize the gun trade. Bad guys would not have become bad guys if guns had not been available. And wide-scale availability of guns in inner cities normalizes criminality, carries 08. It is easier for black men to obtain guns than textbooks. Homicide about 90% is the leading cause of death for black youth. The introduction of easily available guns has created a disaster. However, Americans seem immune to this problem. Public attitude is normal. There's an acceptance of death in urban America. And surrounded by gunshots, children are also doomed to a cycle of poverty and violence, like 02. Children exposed to gun violence experience psychological effects. In inner-city Philadelphia, 3/4 had heard gunfire, and 1/3 had seen someone shot. Exposure with violence was correlated with more anxiety, depression, lower GPA, more absences from school, and 19% wished they committed suicide. And gun violence is also a structural cause of inequality. Schumann 15. Widespread availability of guns is a significant cause of inequality. Guns make life less stable for people. People think of violent crime as a result of poverty, but in fact, violent crime also causes poverty. And gun violence affects blacks disproportionately. Pew Research Center in 2013. In 2010, there were 11,000 homicides from firearms. Blacks were 55% of victims, with 13% of the population. Thus, the standard for this round is breaking the cycle of gun violence in inner-city communities. Solvency. Most criminals acquire guns from private parties, meaning that universal background checks solve. Whitney 13. Private party sales are an important contributor to firearm violence. 80% of felons acquire their guns from private parties. And reducing availability also decreases lethal youth violence. Fagan 2. Adolescents in cities are carrying guns on a large scale. An increase in gun availability fuels an increase in youth violence. Reducing availability reduces youth violence. And more regulation reduces availability of guns. Lafayette 2000. The more widely available guns, the more people murdered. The correlation is 0.84 between gun prevalence and murder. However, restricting availability affects the price of guns on illicit markets, because as we restrict availability, the supply in secondary markets decreases and the cost increases. As a result, this diminishes teenagers' abilities to obtain guns. Since teenagers commit the most deadly crimes, decreasing availability will decrease homicides, and raising prices decreases the amount in circulation. Douglas 02. Demand for guns is elastic. A 1% increase in price lowers demand by 3%. Also, universal background checks empirically raise the prices. Bandler 16. Universal background checks drive up the price from $60 to $125. And the most comprehensive study ever done confirms that more regulation means less deaths. McDonald in 2016. The largest study ever conducted found a clear link between firearm regulation and fewer gun-related deaths. The team reviewed 130 high-quality studies conducted over 60 years. Restricting access is associated with reduction in deaths, and Missouri empirically proves this. Portero in 2013. Universal background checks have an enormous impact. Post-repeal, the annual homicide was 25% above the pre-repeal mean, and statistical projections prove that this will happen also in all 50 states. Callison 16. Universal background checks reduce firearm mortality by 65%. Preferred this A point is that this studies all 50 states in the United States, and B, this study also controls for multiple factors and specifically isolates UBCs without other factors. Also, we cut off the illicit market. Dixon writes, by reducing the pool of guns, it reduces the number of guns in the hands of criminals. Illegal guns are dependent on the presence of legally purchased guns, and we empirically proved this, as Walensky in 2014 writes. Analysts control for policing, incarceration, poverty, and other factors. However, states with more expensive background laws experience 48% less gun trafficking. Also, proliferation of guns in states with weak gun laws are the problems for inner cities. Cole Morgan is 16. It isn't a failure of the city's gun laws. Most guns used in Chicago come from neighboring states with lax gun laws that do not require background checks for gun show sales or private sales like Indiana. Thus, we affirm.
We will take a little bit of prep. We'll start now. Okay. Is everybody ready?
Yep.
Okay. We negate and our sole contention is that federal gun policy rolls back progress. Subpoint A is grassroots movements. Efforts to reduce gun violence are gaining steam in the status quo. According to Alec McGillis of the New Republic, after the 2012 Newtown shooting, a well-funded and highly organized grassroots movement positioned to take on the gun lobby has emerged for the first time. Michelle Richnick of MSNBC continues in 2014. This new campaign for comprehensive gun control has been successful at the state level, restricting ammunition purchases, establishing gun-free zones near schools, and repealing open carry laws. Indeed, in the 3 years following Sandy Hook, 138 new gun violence prevention laws were enacted across 42 states. However, these strides in gun legislation would grind to a halt after a national implementation of universal background checks. Kristen Goss, professor of political science at Duke University, argues that top-down federal gun control provides few opportunities for civic participation. Instead, it will be seen as an issue in the hands of a small circle of politicians and special interest groups, sending the message that ordinary citizens have no influence on legislative outcomes. The current system is the only one that will work. Tenorio of Columbia University in 2016 finds that while a single gun control law doesn't produce any tangible benefits, a comprehensive series of regulations can effectively save lives. Ultimately, Weber of Boston Children's Hospital in 2016 quantifies that states with the most gun laws had a gun mortality rate 42% lower than states with the fewest laws. Subpoint B is emboldening the NRA. At the local level, the NRA lacks the ability to manipulate legislation. According to the New York Times in 2015, the NRA's efforts are constantly beaten back at the state level because it devotes a very small percentage of its resources to state legislatures. At the national level, however, the NRA has immense influence. Sam Musa of Virginia University finds that the NRA spends about $250 million a year on gun rights lobbying in Congress. CNN explains that the NRA explicitly opposed federal universal background checks out of the fear that it may be the start of a slippery slope towards the federal government infringing on states' rights and further restricting Second Amendment rights and ultimately banning guns. Challenging the NRA directly at the federal level would be catastrophic. NPR explains that in response to the federal government's 1994 Brady Act, the NRA repealed a handgun ban in Washington, D.C. and inserted a 10-year sunset clause in the national assault rifle ban. If galvanized, many policies that are currently pushing for, that is legalizing silencers for civilians, will succeed. Mother Jones writes that the NRA lobbying successfully voted out 20 Democratic representatives in the wake of the Brady bill, crafting a Republican majority in the House of Representatives. Subpoint C is increasing gun sales. According to a New York Times analysis of gun policy over the last 16 years, tighter restrictions on guns are robustly correlated with spikes in the sale of firearms. When people anticipate new laws that make it harder to buy guns, they rush to stock up on weapons while they still can. This will be incredibly detrimental in the status quo. As the Chicago Tribune explains, there's little reason for normal people to buy firearms in the status quo thanks to decreases in violent crime, changes in gun culture, and lessening interest in hunting. Fortunately, while a federal law would create a purchasing frenzy, state laws would not. This is for two reasons. First, public attention. Derek Stiegler, author of Guns Illustrated, explains that federal gun policies receive far more media coverage than state laws, spreading the word that restrictions are impending to a larger audience. Second is distrust. According to a nationwide Gallup poll, only 19% of people trust the federal government, while 58% trust their states. Moreover, the Washington Post finds in 2016, a majority of Americans hold the belief that the federal government is trying to take their guns away. These spikes in gun sales have done major damage in the past. Franklin Zimmering of UC Berkeley notes, in the 4 years leading up to the implementation of the Federal Gun Control Act of 1968, handgun sales quadrupled to 2.4 million. This is especially problematic as David Hardy of William and Mary Law finds these guns were responsible for an even larger increase in homicides proportionally. Thus, we urge you to negate. Thank you.
Okay, 12 seconds. Can I have the first question?
Yeah, can you wait for a second?
Yeah, I got you. Alright. Yeah. When will Texas and Oklahoma ever adopt universal background checks?
I don't know.
Yeah, well, do you think they'll do so anywhere in the next 20 years?
Universal background checks? Probably not. Because we
Okay,
think it's
sure.
objectively a bad policy. Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about the thing you say at the top of the case, right?
Yeah.
So what would your side characterize as the most important impact on the round?
Breaking inner city violence.
Breaking inner city violence. And so the way to do so would be to restrict
Access to
homicides
guns.
or access to guns, but
And
specifically
increase
in
violence.
inner cities, right?
Not necessarily, just in general.
In general?
Yeah.
So we can agree to just talking about just decreasing crime in
The
general.
Cole Morgan evidence tells you how the reason as to why these guns are flowing into inner cities, which usually have
But that's not my question. My question is, when you're looking at impact in today's debate, should we be looking at restricting access to guns? So you, wait, so that's not what you just told me.
to inner cities, that's our argument.
Okay, so you want to prioritize inner cities.
Correct.
Why is that?
Number one, the media lacks the focus of them now, so our arguments like this debate round should be used.
I mean,
but second of
Oh,
all,
wait, but there are many,
gun violence in inner
but
cities are destroying
there are many
communities.
other areas in which the media, one, undercovers the problems of gun violence, right? I say like the media just
Saying
undercovers
that
gun
inner
violence
city-
in general.
Gun violence in the status quo is locking inner cities in a It's causing structural inequality and oppression within these inner cities.
Okay, so we should try to stop violence in inner cities
That's
first.
our argument.
Okay, I just want to clarify that
Yeah.
because you kind of said about crime in general. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the framing all links back to inner cities, but sure. All right,
Sure.
let's go to your arguments.
Okay.
So you have states and status quo are adopting more gun control policies, right?
Yes.
How can you prove to me that super red states, for example, Wyoming, Texas, or Oklahoma, will adopt more gun control?
We say that one is already happening. So 42 states,
what?
both red and blue, are already doing
42
so.
states.
But
There's
two,
still 8 states with the
we say
legal
there are
right?
several reasons why states where people living in those states find federal reform much more distasteful than state reform. One, they trust that their state's governments aren't going to take their
But
guns
will
away.
the state government ever pass these laws? For example,
We
if
say
there's
yes.
a GOP-controlled Senate in like Oklahoma that has 80% GOP members, will
Right,
they
but
ever
we,
pass
we,
these
we say that
reforms?
in the status quo, because grassroots movements are gaining momentum, the answer is yes. Can I ask you a quick question?
Wait, so what, okay, sure.
So so let's talk about your warrants, right? So you don't really delineate any of your case, but one of them that you allude to is private party sales, right?
Yeah.
Why would this go down?
Because we require universal background checks on it.
What's the mechanism?
So the resolution states universal background checks on all sales and transfers of ownership. So when we vote affirmative, we force universal background checks on private parties.
Okay, so my question is, how would you hold these private parties accountable? Are you
So-
able to trace the guns to every
Our
private party
argument is
transaction?
first, there's a high compliance rate in states with universal background checks. But second of all, just because
Okay,
there
wait.
isn't a cop around doesn't mean I'm
How
going
high?
to murder you.
How high?
78%.
We say that the 22% are probably the people who are routine criminals, right? Who are trafficking huge amounts
Sure,
of guns.
that's still 80%
right?
solvency coming out of
No,
that.
because the 72% of other are like minor sales. They're not the ones who are the major like sellers who are
These
fueling
private
crimes,
parties
right?
they don't sell like bulks of guns.
There's
Those are
a difference.
FFLs.
There are many kinds of private transfers. There's a kind of private transfer in which I buy like 50 guns and they sell them like to fuel gang violence. Or there's I buy one gun and just give it to my friend, right? So maybe in the latter is included in the 72%. Right, and I would say that the 72% are all just like giving my gun to a friend, not like the distribution of firearms you're talking about.
Okay, opponents ready? All the judges ready? Excellent. Dan, are you ready? The map's just going to be just top bottom through the case, treating arguments. Okay, first let's talk about the notion that federal reform is going to stifle state level reform. This is just not true, and this is historically proven untrue by gun control in the past. First, Robert Longley of Thought in 2017 just outlines the time, like the history of gun control, and finds after the Brady Bill was implemented, and also like the assault weapons ban in 1994, which should have stifled state legislation if their arguments are true, actually saw an increase in the amount of states and like municipalities and cities and people suing gun companies more for millions of dollars at a time. Where you actually see states implementing more harsh restrictions on gun shows and more assault weapons bans. And overall, you see more state-level activity and more citizen and grassroots-level activity after the passage of the assault weapons ban, which they say should have stifled federal reform. Next, they overall just tell you like the overall like states are successful in like passing gun control. I would argue though, Judge, in hard red states like Texas, you're never going to see this state level reform, and that's a problem. Insofar as Keller Morgan in our case directly tells you the reason why you see gun violence going up in states that have strict gun control is because states that don't have gun control and don't have UBCs, those states proliferate guns into the states that have high gun control. So as long as there's at least one or two states that aren't complying or like aren't passing state level laws, you're not going to see overall homicides decreasing. And next, I'll tell you like a single law can't like decrease homicides. I'd argue there's a bunch of other gun control in the status quo, and UBCs just build on top of that and effectively build on top of that, and then they just say like a single law isn't going to solve problems, and it's bad if it's like a top-down approach. Remember, one, the approach is not top-down, and two, if the law is good, I don't know why you wouldn't pass it. We decrease homicide by like 65%. It's pretty cool. Now on the NRA, so there's a bunch of arguments about like why the NRA is not going to have power. First, overall, in these upcoming midterms, the problem is Democrats are actually going to win a ton of seats if they pass, if we pass like background checks. So first, the Frisella time in 2017 includes overall gun control is going to motivate the Democratic base, not make them complacent, meaning that overall the NRA is going to have a huge uphill battle if they want to actually influence elections in this upcoming midterm. They're not going to be able to oust people. Next, like on just general NRA lobbying, there's a lot of different problems with this. So first, the fact the NRA membership is not necessarily agreeing with the NRA administration on this, and the NRA membership is the ones who do the voting. As Think Progress in 2017 or 2012 concludes overall, the NRA is actually losing enthusiasm over the past few decades in terms of this membership, and barring a massive return to rural living or hunting, we're going to see enthusiasm for gun ownership decreasing. And overall, Bloomberg and Watts concludes that even that 87% of the members of the NRA themselves favor universal background checks, meaning they're not going to come out and vote against them. Now, on campaigns and like elections and ousting people. First, like all these responses are going to reply directly to the 1994 elections, which they say the NRA won. Also, the gun ban in DC, that was a Supreme Court case unrelated to the NRA entirely. So first, I argue that the NRA doesn't actually contribute enough to the campaigns. Think Progress of 2012 also concludes the NRA usually only donates 0.2% of a candidate's budget, and moreover, even when the NRA donates over $100,000, they still win a net negative number of those elections. Moreover, Think Progress concludes the NRA's influence in these elections is pretty much just minimal. It's just absolutely zero. And plus, the NRA backs candidates that were already going to win anyways, and so literally they just claim victories for unopposed candidates and elections they were going to win anyways. Also, lastly, on the NRA ousting members after 1994 gun ban. The thing is though, there were a bunch of other Think Progress tells us there's a bunch of other debates at that time about Don't Ask, Don't Tell, a bunch of failed healthcare reform, other crime reform, and NAFTA. There's a ton of other debates that handed Republicans the House and that handed the legislature. In that case, overall, and then lastly, they say overall, there's a bunch of legislation they're pushing for legalizing silencers or something. I would argue if the NRA is powerful and the Republicans control the House and literally the entire government, you would see this passing if the NRA was actually powerful. Moreover, Vox in 2017 includes the NRA, the NRA's money and the NRA's donations to existing Congresspeople doesn't actually do anything. The NRA or the GOP senators and Republicans, overall, they just vote against gun control. That's their party platform, not because of financial incentives from the NRA. Overall, the NRA has no power. Lastly, on gun sales, the problem here is first, Fiat is going to solve this, right? When you vote affirmative, you implement the law immediately. You don't take 4 years like it did during the Obama administration. And two, they say people have little reason to buy guns. I would argue stocking up is not going to occur in inner cities, where we tell you is the most important impact on the round. Most of the violence in inner cities is actually perpetrated by teens who, one, aren't going to have the money to stock up, and two, not going to have the ability, and then three, overall, you're actually going to see an increase in prices of guns. So even if people want to stock up, they can't buy them. And lastly, I would argue leaving open loopholes to criminals and leaving open black market activity and gun violence in these communities is going to be far outweighed by a short-term increase in guns.
My opponents begin with an overview that says we should look to inner cities first. The biggest problem with this is that it's entirely non-unique. New York, Chicago, Detroit, Trenton, LA, Compton, all these centers of inner city violence are in liberal states that have universal background checks already. Insofar as the majority of inner cities literally have this policy, they bottleneck themselves into impacting to inner cities that are in conservative states that do not have universal background checks. So if you believe their own framework, they're bottlenecking their own offense. But even so, we do see a meaningful articulation from the affirmative side about the problems of inner city violence. However, what they miss is that the root cause of gun violence is not just singular. There are many root causes of gun violence, and therefore we say that the most important impact in today's round should be a multifaceted approach to a multifaceted problem, one in which there are several gun control policies that are complementary and correct for each other's flaws. And that's what we've been seeing in recent years, according to Richnick from NBC. On a state and local level in the past 3 years, we've seen 42 states implement 138 pieces of policies. These are things like restriction on gun ammunition, things like the rejection of open carry laws, and things like the rejection of open carry zones, right? So this is incredibly effective empirically because according to the Washington Post, we're at a 40-year low when it comes to gun household ownership. And according to Weber of the Boston Children's Hospital, when you look at the states with the most gun control policy, they have 42% less deaths than the states with the least gun control policy. The multifaceted approach is the only thing that can solve the multifaceted problem that my opponents articulate in their own case. Don't have a one-size-fits-all universal background check policy if it precludes all of this progress. With that said, let's go into my opponent's solvency. It's sort of a potpourri of muddled arguments about each different thing, but I'll try and respond to what I picked up. The first thing they said is that we're going to stop private party sales. This assumes the efficacy of universal background checks. There are actually several reasons, structural barriers that will prevent it from being efficacious. The first comes from the Daily Beast, which finds that the National Rifle Association will put riders into these bills that will prevent them from being enforced. For example, in recent policies, they've refused the ATF's ability to digitize their records, right? So these are things that make it incapable of being enforced. Empirically, they've done it 15 times already. But even if it is enforceable, according to USA Today, on the state level, it will not happen because police departments do not record the names of fugitives into the national database. In fact, it's found the FBI is lacking the names of millions of felons, so they will be able to pass through the system. But even if this policy is structurally sound, the incentives on the ground are such that individuals will not enforce this. Why is this the case? Well, according to Policy Mike, the Justice Department categorically does not prosecute background theft fraud, background check fraud. That means that if I'm a gun seller and I want to sell a gun, my incentive to do so will always outweigh my incentive to not do so because I know that the Justice Department will never go out with me, since it will never come after me because I know that they only go after 1% of cases of fraud. And lastly, even so, we would say that ultimately, even if this discourages people from buying it in a legal way, they will buy it in an illegal way because straw purchasers can still pass background checks and then sell guns to the illegal market. Ultimately, this is unsound. But let's move on to their arguments about increasing the prices of guns. We would say first that the national universal background check will cause a massive increase in the demand for guns because the New York Times finds that there's a robust relationship between gun control policy and in the interim period, people going and buying lots of guns. In fact, Zimmering finds in 1968 that before the Gun Control Policy Act, we saw a quadrupling in gun purchases up to 2.4 million. So on net, we're seeing an increase in sales. But second, their arguments about the cost of background check are overstated, because according to John Hay of Outdoor Life, a background check only costs us $10 to $35. And insofar as Mayors Against Illegal Guns finds that the average gun on the black market costs $400, this is a marginal increase at best. The demand for it will remain inelastic. Their last argument is about selling guns to illegal, is preventing the sale of guns in illegal markets. We have a few responses. First off, they assume that if you have a universal background check, conservative states will enforce it. That's problematic because they won't. According to News 21, 8 conservative states have already vowed to avoid all federal gun control law enforcement, ultimately meaning that, this is actually crucial because their framework is all about preventing inner city deaths. All the liberal states already have universal background checks. All the inner cities and conservative states will not implement this policy, ultimately meaning that they have no impacts. But moreover, we would say that if you want to stop illegal gun trafficking, it's far preferable to do this on a local and state level, because according to Webster of Johns Hopkins, when New York City implemented undercover investigations, they were able to reduce illegal gun trafficking by 84%. The progress we're seeing right now solves back with the problems that they're talking about. We're very proud to indicate.
First question. Sure. Okay, so right at the end of your speech, you told me directly conservative states aren't going to enforce federal gun control laws. Doesn't that mean at all they're definitely not going to enforce state-level laws, which they would have direct control over?
No. So for a few things here. First, we say that they won't implement a universal background check, right?
No.
That's
wait. Where do you prove to me, though, that conservative states, like deep red states, like Alabama, Texas, they're going to implement state-level reform akin or like something that
so
will
we
solve
proved that.
problems.
We proved that with our Richneck evidence, right? That finds that 42 states. That means it has to be red and blue. Yes, 8 states are left out.
Some of them. 8 states are left out. That's problematic,
yeah,
right?
That's really problematic for you, because I have a question. So your framework is all about preventing inner city violence, right?
Yes.
Okay. So which inner cities are not in states that already have universal background checks?
Right? Let's respond to this by the fact that overall, it doesn't matter if inner cities are in blue states or red states. If you don't have gun control in at least one or two, like if you're missing gun control in 1 or 2 states, the problem is the Commonwealth evidence, which you totally drop, says that those states that don't have gun control proliferate guns into the inner cities with a ton of gun control.
Okay, so hold on. So basically your impact is only on gun trafficking from conservative states to inner cities, right?
I mean, it's just to any state that doesn't have gun control.
Okay, sure. Do you have a question?
Yeah, sure. So you just tell me, people aren't going to enforce it, or again, let's talk about this on the state level, right?
Okay.
So, wouldn't we still see increases in homicide at state levels if they definitely have control over the laws and they're never going to enforce them directly?
I'm confused by the question.
So wouldn't we just see gun homicides increasing in laws in states where they don't pass the laws, or they don't pass whatever state level reform?
No, why would that be the case?
Because they don't enforce any gun control laws at all?
No, we're saying that the only way these conservative states are going to have some sort of laws is if it happens naturally on the state level, because there's so much resentment to the top-down approach of federal policy. Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
Great. So I want to talk about this idea of collective action. Basically, who's going to be more mobilized after we have a universal background check? So can we agree that the people who are really, really into guns, like the big gun right advocates, they're the ones who are far more mobilized and far more likely to be single-issue voters?
Okay, so voter enthusiasm gap, right?
Yes.
One, if you brought that up in speech, we would have read evidence that directly says the voter enthusiasm gap between pro-gun control and anti-gun control has actually closed in the most recent elections. But 2, I would argue that Democrats are directly motivated by gun control to come out and win these midterms. But 3, the NRA doesn't have the power to influence these elections.
You're not really answering my question, though.
I did. The voter enthusiasm gap closed, which is what you're
Wait, what do you mean the voter enthusiasm gap closed?
Okay, so one-issue voters, right, are far more enthused or enthusiastic about voting for gun control, or voting against gun control, right? And the thing is, that gap has empirically closed.
Why is it the case that the majority of Americans support gun control, but we're seeing lacking policy?
What?
Basically, what I'm saying is that when you have fringe voters on the right,
generally the GOP.
all right. So okay,
It's not the NRA. It's just generally the GOP voting against it. Yeah.
Right. So at the end of your rebuttal, you talk about fiating this immediately.
Yeah.
So when in public forum is it ever the case that you can just say this policy will be enacted and we're skipping over the entire legislative process?
So when in public forum does it say we're going to take a whole presidential administration of 8 years and not pass a policy, right? This is a question.
No.
This is a question.
We should look at the practical implementation of this actually happening.
Wait. I mean, if this was the case, though, and we look at the normal legislative process, in the normal legislative process, gun control and UBCs never pass. This is why we have to change the debate environment about policy discussion, right? Is to make it pass in the affirmative world. That's really how we're able to have ground on the app.
Alright, so starting with you. They say how these inner cities already have strict gun laws. However, they concede the Cole Morgan evidence at the bottom of the case that tells you that the reason as to why guns are proliferating into inner cities is because they're surrounded by states with weak gun laws, which means only federal reform solves. That's also terminal defense to the entire negative case, because they cannot prove to you that every single state will adopt these gun laws, which means that you can pull the trigger for the F right there. Then the next argument make that there's many causes of gun violence. Even if we don't solve for the cause, we still decrease the amount of guns that are used in these crimes and decrease gun violence in inner city communities. This is going to come from source because they concede all the impacts. First, extended Reich and Schumann evidence tells you how gun violence locks these communities in a cycle of poverty and hurts future generations. It causes massive inequality in these communities. Then extended Pew evidence that tells you how it kills 11,000 Americans each year, which is 100,000 over a decade. This outweighs on magnitude and time frame because we're affecting future generations directly with federal reform. They've also conceded a standard, which means that you filter all offensive around into linking into inner city communities. Absent that, you cannot give them a negative ballot. Let's go to solvency. The first argument to make is outriders. However, we fiat the resolution now, meaning that we only pass universal background checks. But second of all, this is empirically proven false because states with universal background checks have less violence. That is conceded Calisant and Portero evidence in the bottom number case that tells you empirically how states with background checks have 65% less homicides. They concede empirics. Then they say how there's no enforcement. However, 78% enforcement. Then the next argument to make is that straw purchases. However, Miller tells you how there's going to be decrease in straw purchases because now the buyers held liable for every gun sale they make, but also they conceded Voloski evidence that tells you there's a decrease in 48% in illicit market trafficking. Then to make the argument how there's an interim period and people are going to stock up, how these inner city youths, which are mostly teenagers committing these crimes, do not have the ability to stock up, which takes out their argument. They've also conceded the Dixon evidence that tells you it would decrease the illicit market as well as also the impurity. Clean half ballot right now. Then let's go to their case really quickly. Under B point, extended Frisco evidence that tells you gun control will motivate the Democrats' base, which means we will swing midterms and actually allow Democrats to take back the Senate. Then extend the evidence that tells you how the NRA has no power, actually loses net negative of elections. Also, the Cole Morgan evidence takes out the case.
So, what I'm going to do is an overview response in their case, weighing, and then my subpoint B. Okay. Was everybody good? They say that the most important impact is stopping inner city violence, but recognize that this is non-unique because the majority of inner cities are in liberal states which already have universal background checks. Therefore, the only link they have into any of their impacts is closing the state fragmentation gap. That's where the News 21 evidence comes in, which they forgot to respond to in summary, which is really damning. What that says is conservative states, which are the ones who are not currently implementing universal background checks, will never do so. Let me give you a few examples. For example, liberal states have sanctuary cities that refuse to enforce federal immigration law, for example. This is really important because these conservative states will void federal regulation on universal background check. They have no solvency at the end of today's debate. Now let's talk about how we outweigh in today's round. We say that specifically why there's still so much violence in inner cities despite having universal background checks is that we don't have a comprehensive, multifaceted solution. And Richard tells you that the solutions are coming. 138 policies have passed in 42 states, and empirically they have reduced violence by 42% and reduced trafficking specifically by 84%. Therefore, the most effective solution to inner city violence comes from the negative in today's round. If we can prove to you that the universal background check trades off with these policies, we're going to be a very clear negative ballot in today's debate. Let's talk about how that happens. That's going to be our second subpoint on in voting the NRA. They have a few responses. First, they say that there's a lot of reforms after Brady Act. Their evidence says there's a lot of lawsuits, not reforms, and they only resorted to lawsuits when reforms failed. They couldn't get anything passed in legislatures. But then they say that the NRA has no enthusiasm gap. Their evidence only talks about Virginia. Now let's talk. Then they say that NRA is losing influence in the status quo. We agree, which is why it's really bad to affirm because you re-embolden the NRA. Because we tell you, one, people really distrust the federal government, so it really empowers the NRA with a powerful narrative of protecting their guns from the federal government and Big Brother. But second, they say it's a slippery slope argument. This is really important because one, we tell the NRA is better organized, and two, better funded, and three, because their voters are more enthusiastic, so they're able to roll back local reform. This is really important. They said that the NRA can't influence politics, but the NRA has influence other than just money. For example, they're a really dedicated single group voter base, but secondly, they rate these politicians so no one else are able to vote for them, right, if they don't give them an A rating. This is really important. The impact is one, they vote out 20 Democratic senators. Our study isolates for the impact the NRA has, it was very specific, and two, we tell you they voted out local policy in the wake of Brady. We urge you to negate.
All right, can we get the first question? Yeah, sure. All right, so, okay, let's go. So you said how the NRA so why is Virginia invalid?
Why is the evidence from the most recent elections we have?
Okay, I mean, so we talked
why
about
is that invalid?
You said that there's no voter enthusiasm gap
Yeah,
between
most
liberals and
recent
Republicans.
elections,
You gave us evidence that looks only to Virginia.
Yeah,
We're saying
most recent
If I may,
election.
you give us literally zero evidence, right?
no.
So
I mean,
I'm going with the only thing I have.
we're making a logical case for why this is true.
But it's empirically false, so-
No. Listen, your single
Also-
evidence about Virginia doesn't disprove the idea
Most recent
that
election.
if you can let us speak, right? The people who are pro-guns are far more organized and mobilized than people who are anti-guns. The NRA has a far more mobilized base and far more funding than the gun control people. That is just like fact on the ground.
But
Your
al-
evidence about Virginia does
But
not.
also
disprove that.
specifically, Virginia is not the only race that happened in this year's elections, right? Like
Sure,
elections
it's
happened
a
in
super
Oregon,
race.
right, in other states, right? The fact your evidence only looks
But
at one
you
state
don't
means that
give
there's
me
still an
anything to weigh it
enthusiasm gap
against.
in those other states,
Okay,
right?
so is there anything to weigh this against?
What?
Is there anything to weigh this against?
What do you mean?
Is there any election since 1994 that, like, we see this happening?
Seen what happened?
All of your impacts about the NRA and enthusiasm.
Yeah, I mean,
and, like,
Yeah, we
Yeah,
give
we
you
can
a
give
lot
you
of
lots of
examples,
examples
right?
about this.
We tell you one that after the Brady Bill, they managed
That was
to
1994.
Right, but we.
Is there anything since then at all? Anything?
Well, there haven't been any federal policy
exactly.
since then, right?
Yeah, we would say that the
They
the
can't-
reason we have so much local and state progress right now is precisely because there haven't been any massive federal attempts at gun control policy. If there were, we would say
No.
probably you wouldn't see so much progress in the state and
What
local.
about the box settlements, which directly tells you, right, when you outweigh the incentives the NRA gives to, like, GOP senators and GOP, like, legislatures overall, they still don't change their votes. The NRA literally can't swing a vote. No matter what, no matter how much money you give to a GOP
Wait, I
senator.
told you that
Yeah.
one is not about money. There are several powerful ways the NRA influences political elections.
Okay, what about the
one?
fact that the administration and the voters don't
Can
agree?
I answer your
Oh,
question?
yeah, sure, go ahead.
Right. One, they're able to demonize their opponents. They craft a powerful counter-narrative that their opponents are corrupt and they're out to violate individual liberties. The way they do so is by rating like the politicians. So if the NRA gives them like a C rating, many people who are conservative won't vote for that candidate and functionally dooms his
Okay.
candidacy.
So
right?
do you know if those candidates are right? So let's talk about these elections where you supposedly ousted Democrats.
Yes.
Do you know that the Democrats weren't already going to lose?
Yes, our evidence specifically isolates.
It just says that Democrats lost seats.
No.
Pre-election data, right, indicates that right before the Brady bill, right, Democrats were going to absolutely
We spent like 2.5 minutes talking about
I
this.
mean, I argue like that's what still lapsed.
Well, can we ask you a question? Okay, great. So we've agreed that the majority of inner cities and the majority of inner city violence happens in states that already have universal background checks. So can we agree that the entirety of your impacts come from interstate trafficking to those states, correct?
No, I mean there's still inner cities like outside of like liberal states like
Right, but the
So the vast majority of inner cities and inner city violence occur in liberals, exist in
but
liberal
if I may
states.
though, right, like your card about or like your case is about leaving reform to the state level, right, directly perpetuates violence in liberal states, right?
Okay,
Because
you're still
conservative
not-
states don't
Why is it
don't enact reform. Okay, opponents ready? Are all the judges ready? Excellent. And Daniel, are you ready? The overview is just, or rather, the map's in the first data overview about like, non-unique violence in inner cities. Then it's down the con, extending defensive responses, and then coming back to the pro, going over the solvency and or winning the round. So, oh yeah, like the framing obviously when I get to the pro. But we're gonna start on the overview. First, they tell us it's not unique, but again, this entire round, they dropped the Kelmore evidence, which directly tells you because, like, the reason, like, liberal inner cities have violence with gun control is because states that don't have, like, gun control proliferate guns into those states. And they directly tell you conservative states don't enforce gun control at the state level, right? Overall, we directly tell you, right, that's why you're going to see more violence. That just turns out literally their entire case. Also, they say conservative states are going to avoid legislation. I would argue at the federal level, you at least have some risk of enforcement in terms of, like, the supremacy clause and, like, having, like, federal, like, legislation and federal enforcement. Now it's back on the con case. First, they say, like, the legislation at the state level failed after the Brady Act. That's just not true. Suits went through, and there are a few like regulations on like assault weapons bans. Overall, even if any of these reforms went through, their arguments just proven false. Also, they dropped the Frizzle evidence, which directly tells you like overall Democrats are going to be motivated by passing gun control, meaning the Dems are actually going to get the midterms and oust the Republicans. Overall, we see like this, their voter argument goes the other way. Next, also they dropped like the enthusiasm argument that says directly like in the most recent elections, the voter enthusiasm gap like of the NRA members or whatever has actually closed. They also don't respond to the fact the NRA won. In the Vox evidence says they can't. The NRA doesn't influence existing elections and they can't influence the existing congressmen. Where the NRA and its membership actually disagree on the issue of background checks. I mean, the NRA membership and the voters aren't going to go vote. And then lastly, they say like they isolate how like 20 Democrats lost their seats. No, they don't. The Think Progress evidence does that, and they directly tell you the NRA had no influence in that election. The Democrats were already going to lose, and the NRA just backs elections. They're already going to win, and they claim victory. Now back on the pro case. First, they're saying like the Fromm and the Schumann evidence, which are going to tell you overall we're going to decrease gun violence in inner cities by implementing nationwide background checks. And Reich tells you we're going to end the cycle of poverty and crime because gun violence ends up with like people in jail for life and orphans. Overall, that leads to more poverty and leads to more crime. We're going to stop back to the very root cause of crime. And they say that we need a multifaceted reform. No, UBCs are enough. That's why Callison directly tells you when you implement nationwide UBCs, you see 65% decrease in homicides, particularly in inner cities. Now let's just go down to like the solvency first. Remember, we're going to fill out the resolution, like eliminating riders. Lastly, like UBC levels on the state also extend the Miller evidence, which directly tells you we're going to make it more liable. We're going to make people more liable for straw purchase and illegal trafficking. And Velosky directly tells you you decrease trafficking by 48%. And lastly, on stocking up, again, teens don't have the ability to stock up, and they're the root cause of like violence in these inner cities. Overall, we decrease gun availability and price, and thus, in homicide.
We agree with our opponents that the most important impact should be to inner cities. However, note that the majority of inner cities are in liberal states. So the entirety of my opponent's impacts are on gun trafficking from conservative states to liberal states. However, this is extremely problematic because the crucial piece of evidence, the analysis they have not once responded to throughout this entire round, comes from News 21, which finds that conservative states simply will not enforce a federal background check. We give the example, for instance, of sanctuary cities, a federal policy that was implemented on a national level but was not enforced on the state level. That means that my opponents literally have no impact. In inner cities and liberal states, universal background checks already exist, and in the conservative states that they say there's going to be trafficking from, the universal background check will not be implemented. But even so, we would say that the root cause of the problems in inner cities are multifaceted. There's not just one root cause. We therefore say that we need to have some sort of multifaceted approach. That's been happening recently. According to Richnick, in the past few years, we've seen 138 pieces of legislation, things like restricting ammo, more gun-free zones, and less open carry laws. The impact of this, according to Weber, is that the states with the most gun policy have 42% less mortality. The most important impact, therefore, is continuing this progress. And we do this through our subpoint P on the NRA. We say that if you have universal background checks, the NRA will be strengthened and be able to mobilize their citizens to lobby in two ways. First, through mobilizing and capitalizing on the distrust of federal government as a result of a federal policy, and second, by framing this as a slippery slope by which the government will steal people's guns. Ultimately, we see that they can influence policy, A, through giving politicians money, and B, by rating politicians, giving them a grade. We get a few responses. First, they say that after the Brady Law, there were still some suits. We say, however, that what happened after the Brady Law actually was that the NRA instituted a sunset clause in an assault rifle ban and gutted policy in D.C. Then they say that Democrats are just as motivated as Republicans. This is just categorically untrue. Their evidence is only from Virginia. In reality, the fact is that people who are more for gun rights are more likely to be single-issue voters, so they're the ones who are more likely to flare up after universal background check policy. Then they say the NRA categorically has no power. I've already articulated how the NRA influences policy. Let's do some weighing. There's a current path to progress right now where we've seen a reduction in violent crime and a reduction in household gun ownership because of policy at a state and local level. My opponents extend some blippy arguments of why a universal background check on a national level might maybe reduce federal illegal gun trafficking. It's far more preferable to prefer the sustainable increase we've seen right now of red flags.